The 1st Muslim Battalion for the war in Afghanistan did not appear by chance. Its creation was directly linked to an appeal by the General Secretary of the Central Committee of the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, Nur Muhammad Taraki, often referred to in the text as Dr. Nurhama. He urged the Soviet leadership to find a way to counter the increasingly active Mujahideen units, which included many disguised mercenaries arriving from neighboring Iran. These people easily penetrated Afghan territory and staged uprisings, fighting against government troops and Soviet advisors. Taraki saw the recruitment of indigenous Central Asians, Uzbeks, Tajiks, and Turkmen as a brilliant idea. From his point of view, they were to be a mirror response to the enemy's tactics. Muslims who spoke the language and were indistinguishable from the local population seemed the ideal tool for a secret war. The decision was made quickly. Already in 1979, the main intelligence directorate, GRU, of the USSR began forming the 1st Muslim Special Forces Battalion. The base for training was a military unit in Chirchik, near Tashkent, in Uzbekistan. Candidates were selected from all over Central Asia. Priority was given to those who had been familiar with Islamic tradition since childhood, understood the culture of the region, and were fluent in Farsi, the language spoken in both Iran and Afghanistan. This was critically important. Dressed in Afghan army uniforms or civilian clothes, these fighters could blend in with the population. It was virtually impossible to distinguish them from real Afghans. The Soviet system of bureaucratic conventions also worked to their advantage here. To cover their tracks, the fighters were issued real Afghan documents, but there was no need to change their names. Uzbeks, Tajiks, and Turkmen originally had surnames and first names that fit perfectly into the local culture, which made the cover story completely believable. Many of them were real doubles of the local residents, and even experienced Mujahideen could not suspect them of being strangers. The battalion was headed by Major Khabib Kalbif, an ethnic Uzbek, an officer with extensive combat experience and unquestionable authority among the personnel. He was in charge of a special forces unit that was seen as elite and unique from the very beginning. The battalion had 3 group commanders, a deputy commander, and a repair department chief. The training for the fighters selected for the 1st Muslim Battalion wasn't just tough, it was brutal. The cadets underwent such grueling training that many of them dropped out during the selection stage. For those who dropped out, it was often a real relief. They thanked God that this endless hell of training was finally over. The selection process was ruthless and merciless. Only the physically and mentally strongest had a chance to join the ranks of future Special Forces fighters. On June 1, 1979, out of approximately 1,000 candidates, only 532 remained. The rest could not withstand either the psychological stress or the physical meat grinder. But even for those who passed, the trials were just beginning. At that time, Afghanistan was rapidly descending into chaos. The General Secretary of the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, Nur Muhammad Taraki, who had once requested the creation of such a battalion, fell victim to palace intrigues. He sensed danger and feared for his life, and not without reason. In September, he was strangled on the orders of his comrade-in-arms and successor, Hafizullah Amin. It was then that the 1st Muslim Battalion played a fateful role. They were to participate in an operation that went down in history under the code name Storm 333. From December 9 to 10, 1979, the 154th Separate GRU Special Forces Detachment, which included the Muslim Battalion, was first transferred to Bagram Air Base and then to Kabul, closer to Amin's presidential palace, the Taj Bek Palace. The official story sounded innocent. The unit was allegedly sent to reinforce the security of government facilities. But in reality, everyone knew that a decisive assault was being prepared. On the night of December 27, 1979, the operation began. 12 combat groups moved towards the palace. According to a carefully developed plan, 2 companies of the Muslim Battalion, together with paratroopers from the 345th Guards Parachute Regiment, were to block the Afghan Army's tank battalions so that they could not interfere with the operation. The 3rd Company, in armored vehicles, served as the strike force. It delivered the Special Forces units Grom and Zenit, the elite of the Soviet Special Forces, to the palace, whose task was to break in and destroy Amin's guards. The battle was short but extremely fierce. Afghan guards loyal to Amin put up fierce resistance, and the palace turned into a living hell. The Muslim battalion lost 7 men killed and 67 wounded that night. Among the seriously wounded was Senior Lieutenant Vladimir Sharapov, a Tajik by nationality. He received several bullet wounds, but, under the influence of painkillers, continued to fight until the end of the battle, commanding his men and not leaving his position. Only after the operation was completed was he taken to the hospital. The operation was a complete success. The palace was taken, Amin was destroyed, and new forces were brought into Kabul. This moment became the starting point for the full-scale introduction of Soviet troops into Afghanistan. For the Muslim battalion, Storm 333 was a baptism of fire, proof of their combat capability and uniqueness. On January 10, 1980, the battalion returned to Uzbekistan. The Muslim battalion's second entry into Afghanistan was much less dramatic and heroic than their first baptism of fire in Operation Storm 333. While the first sortie into Kabul went down in history as a swift and lightning-fast operation, the return to Afghanistan in 1981 seemed almost mundane. On the night of October 28, a column of armored vehicles led by a new commander, Major Igor Stadarevsky, crossed the border near Termez, Uzbekistan. By that time, the composition of the battalion had completely changed. Many veterans had already served their time and were replaced by new fighters. Now there were more Russians in the unit, but there were still quite a few natives of Central Asia. It was they, who knew the local language and traditions, who often became indispensable in reconnaissance and search operations. This time, the battalion was stationed in the northern Afghan province of Jowzjan, not far from the village of Akka. Their base was an open field surrounded by crops and a tangled network of irrigation ditches. It was an extremely dangerous place. The camp was clearly visible from the air, and the dense system of irrigation canals allowed the enemy to sneak up on their positions unhindered. To minimize the risk, Major Stadarevsky resorted to a trick. He placed his personnel in pits dug directly into the rocky Afghan soil. These peculiar dugouts were covered with wooden planks and camouflaged with tents. At first glance, it looked like an ordinary tent camp, but in reality, the soldiers were in shelters that could save them from sudden shelling or air raids. On November 7th, the anniversary of the October Revolution, the Muslim battalion received a combat mission. The militants, who were customarily called Basmachi in the battalion, continuing a tradition dating back to the 1920s, kidnapped the provincial governor. It was a daring crime. The kidnapping of an official threatened to destabilize the entire region and was a challenge to the Soviet command. Intelligence had to not only find but also free the governor, and do so quickly and quietly. The operation was entrusted to Senior Lieutenant Posikov's company. Acting covertly and swiftly, the Special Forces found the captured governor in the village of Megajak. A short but fierce firefight ensued. During the battle, 15 militants were killed and 5 more were captured. The governor was freed alive and unharmed, which was a great success and strengthened the battalion's reputation. The spoils of the operation included not only weapons and ammunition, but also several horses left behind by the slain Basmachi. These animals unexpectedly turned out to be a strategically important find. Major Stadarevsky decided to use them for reconnaissance and pursuit. In the conditions of the northern Afghan steppe, crisscrossed by irrigation ditches, canals, and rocky outcrops, armored vehicles were often powerless. The enemy easily escaped along narrow paths inaccessible to armored personnel carriers and Ural trucks. Now, however, the Special Forces had an advantage. The men from Central Asia were excellent horsemen and could easily catch up with the enemy on horseback where the vehicles got stuck. Once, it was the mounted vanguard that saved an entire company of Special Forces from certain death. It was nighttime, and the unit was moving on foot along a narrow path leading through villages and fields. In the darkness, they could hear only the splashing of water and the occasional neighing of horses. Ahead of them was a small group of horsemen dressed in Afghan clothing. The silhouettes seemed so natural in the local landscape that even the insurgents themselves did not suspect anything. The militants, lying in ambush, mistook the horse patrol for their own, called out to them, and even warned them in Uzbek, "Get out of the way, horsemen, the Shuravi are coming after you." For the insurgents, this was a common practice, their own people sending signals to their own. But the special forces, understanding perfectly well that this was their company, reacted instantly. Without giving themselves away, they opened fire directly on the ambush. A few short bursts, flashes in the darkness, and all the militants' preparations went up in smoke. The horses had to be abandoned, and the soldiers had to retreat quickly, covering each other with automatic fire. The ambush was foiled, and the company avoided a bloody massacre. After this incident, on the direct orders of General Kremiv, the cavalry vanguard, which had proven its effectiveness, had to be transferred to local formations. But the memory of that episode remained. A single trick saved dozens of lives. In general, the Muslim battalion was often assigned tasks that others considered impossible. For example, they repeatedly defended and evacuated the families of Afghan officers whose homes were located in remote villages, effectively under the control of the Mujahideen. The operations followed the same pattern. The unit blocked the village, quickly entered it, surrounded the house where armed militants had already gathered, and drove a vehicle up to the gate. Women and children were loaded into the back of the truck in a panic, along with their meager belongings, while the special forces fought off attackers, gaining precious minutes. More than once, they arrived literally moments before entire families were to be slaughtered simply because their husband or father served in the government army. Over time, in just 6 months, the battalion had built up a reliable network of agents and effectively held the province of Jowzjan in its grip. The enemy knew that if the road was blocked by vehicles with a round parachute symbol on board, it was better not to even try to attack. These people did not shy away from battle, like many supply convoys, but always accepted it, fiercely and to the end. But the Afghan war was a cruel school, where horror coexisted with the familiar. Once, when coming to the aid of a Soviet motorcade, the battalion's fighters stumbled upon a terrible scene. The body of a killed soldier lay on the road. Before leaving, the enemy had mutilated his body with inhuman cruelty. His joints were shattered, his arms twisted in unnatural directions, his chest cut open with an axe. The major ordered the mutilated body of their fallen comrade to be taken to the camp. There, after assembling all the personnel, he ordered that this gruesome sight be shown to every soldier. This was done deliberately, so that everyone would understand who they were dealing with and that the enemy knew no mercy. For many young Special Forces soldiers, this moment was a turning point. War ceased to be an abstract set of orders and operations. It took on a personal dimension. After this incident, the battalion took no prisoners for 2 weeks. Rage and the desire to avenge their comrades supplanted all other thoughts. They fought fiercely, methodically destroying everyone who got in their way. The battalion's most famous operations were the large-scale sweeps of the villages of Jar-Kudak and Kadarazap, where militants controlled entire areas and Soviet troops had previously been afraid to enter. The battalion gained particular fame for breaking through the blockade of the village of Sankarak. This place was considered virtually impregnable. The village was located in a narrow gorge surrounded by rocks and fortifications, and before the arrival of the Muslim battalion, neither Soviet paratroopers nor the Afghan army dared to enter it. But the detachment managed to break through the defenses, unblock the settlement, and completely drive the enemy out of it. Later, the battalion participated in the destruction of 2 large groups of Mujahideen in the Nikili area, as well as in heavy fighting for the Mormel Gorge, where they had to fight for literally every meter of rocky trails. No less fierce was the assault on the fortified area in Gost and in the vicinity of the stone quarry, where the militants had turned the mountain workings into a kind of impregnable fortress. However, even there, the Special Forces managed to break the resistance using skillful maneuvers and night attacks. Over the years of the war, according to official data, the battalion destroyed about 17,000 militants, captured 990 caravans with weapons, food, and equipment, and took 825 Dushmans prisoner. These were colossal figures for a single unit. It was only on May 18, 1988, after many years of combat operations, that the 154th Special Forces Detachment returned home to the USSR. However, the 154th Battalion was not the only Muslim unit of the GRU Special Forces. In January 1980, another battalion, the 177th, was formed near the city of Kapchagai in the Kazakh SSR. Initially, it was prepared for possible military action against China. Fighters were selected from among Kazakhs, Uyghurs, and other residents of Central Asia who were capable of surviving in the harsh conditions of the mountain steppe terrain and spoke languages close to Farsi. However, as tensions in Afghanistan grew, the command soon decided to transfer this unit to the south as well. On October 29, 1981, the 177th Battalion crossed the border and was deployed in Afghanistan. It was stationed near the city of Maymana in the province of Faryab. His fighters were to go down in the history of the Afghan campaign as the Knights of the Panthers, an elite unit that quickly became the talk of both friends and foes. In the first hours after crossing the Afghan border, the Special Forces found themselves in real combat. No sooner had they settled into their new location than they were ambushed. The enemy opened heavy fire, and a fierce firefight ensued. That day, the scouts had to fend off fanatical attacks by militants who advanced wave after wave, as if testing the Soviet fighters' strength. It was their first baptism of fire, and the unit passed it with flying colors, proving that it was not by chance that it was considered elite. On November 7th, a symbolic date when the USSR celebrated the anniversary of the revolution, the Muslim Battalion found itself in a new predicament. The scouts again had to repel a massive attack by the Dushmans, this time in the area of the prison in Mayman. The battle lasted several hours and became a real test of endurance and discipline. And on November 17th, one of the most difficult battles of the first months of service took place, an 11-hour battle with a large detachment of Basmachi who attacked a supply column accompanied by our special forces. It was a bloody battle. The militants, under the influence of drugs, attacked at full speed, showing no mercy. They shouted the name of their leader, Mevladi Kara, at the top of their lungs, as if invoking his power and encouraging themselves. After the battle, when the battlefield was littered with the bodies of fanatical attackers, one of the Kyrgyz Special Forces soldiers said with a smile, "I don't give a damn about this Mevladi Kara, we have our own Kara Major." By this phrase, he meant their commander, Major Boris Kirimbayev, a Kazakh by nationality, who led his fighters into battle with the same determination and fury as the legendary commanders of the past. Thus, Kirimbayev was forever given the formidable nickname Kara Major, which translates as Black Major. In Afghanistan, this nickname became a symbol of both terror and respect. The enemy feared him so much that they often abandoned their positions just upon hearing that his unit had entered the area of operations. The battalion itself soon received an equally formidable name, the Mad Gang.